My objective today, mine, is to prepare you for the background that is Ragtime. Ragtime is it's based on a historical novel. It was very unusual when E.L. Doctorow wrote this in 1975 because at the time he actually took a lot of grief from the New York Times book review because he was blending actual characters, historical live characters, with fictional characters, and they accused him of rewriting history, which of course everybody does every day now. But at the time, it was a big deal. So in our musical that we're about to see, we have a blend of both historical characters that are being portrayed by actors, and then actors who are playing fictional characters that were created for this particular show. So I want to start with when this musical was in development. One of the first things that the producer did was he had them record a concept album of Ragtime. And the author, E.L. Doctorow, who wrote this novel in 1975, wrote the liner notes for that concept album. And he wrote in those liner notes, high-stepping and syncopated, the music of the ragtime era, as composed by Scott Joplin and others, was a perfect metaphor for the age when all of America was finding a new, sexy rhythm. A modern sensibility was forming that scandalized the old. There were new ideas, bold ways of thinking and behaving, ever-increasing technological changes, and above all, in a country marked by the great wealth of a few and the terrible poverty of many, new and strident demands for social justice. In fact, there were Negroes, there were immigrants, and they could not be ignored. Now, if I read that to you just randomly, if I just bumped into you on the street and read that to you, what era would you assume I was talking about? Today. I want to read that to you one more time. A modern sensibility was forming that scandalized the old. There were new ideas, bold ways of thinking and behaving, ever-increasing technological changes, and above all, in a country marked by the great wealth of a few and the terrible poverty of many, new and strident demands for social justice. This is Ragtime. So, a little bit of the background. As I said, Ragtime was based upon a novel in 1975 written by E.L. Doctorow. The Modern Library ranked it amongst its 100 finest novels written in the English language, and Time magazine ranked it amongst the 100 finest novels written in the English language between 1923 and 2005. So that's how important a story this is. In an interview that E.L. Doctorow gave, one of the first questions was, Ragtime is a sprawling work that begins with, well, your own house in New Rochelle. That's a question. Change the slide, Andre. He writes, in my previous book, the Book of Daniel, it had been published the year before and I had been emotionally depleted. So I sat around for a year and I was staring at the wall and had arranged my desk so that the only way out was through sentences. I began to write about the wall, and I realized that this house was the first house on the hill built at that time. And then I imagined what things looked like from the bottom of the hill. From one image to another, I was off the wall and in a book. So this is the article. You're fine, Andre, you read my mind. Go ahead. This is the article from which that picture comes. That picture was grainy because it was from an old New York Times article. But this is his house on the hill in New Rochelle. So while he was looking for ideas, he turned his chair to the wall and he let the wall talk to him. And then that opened up his mind to what must New Rochelle have been when this house was just built. And from there came the story of Ragtime. Next slide. This is actually Doctorow at his desk, at his house in New Rochelle. And New Rochelle is where this musical begins, in that house, in front of that house, with an unnamed family. Let's take to the next slide. This is a series of paintings, Ellen, catch me on this, by Winslow Homer. I got it. The man has too many names that could be reversed. This is not, Winslow Homer is never addressed in the musical. He's not a character in the musical. But in the book, he sort of begins to frame the light and darkness of this. He writes E.L. Doctorow in the beginning of his novel, this was the time in our history when Winslow Homer was doing his painting. A certain light was still available along the eastern seaboard. Homer painted the light. I'm going to say that again. Homer painted the light. It gave the sea a heavy, dull menace and shone coldly on the rocks and shoals of the New England coast. Now the light is shining on this screen a little bit, but it's the vivid colors here. The background of this particular painting is all pink and bright. And I'm going to translate that sentence from the novel to a lyric in the musical's beginning that says, the days were gently tinted, lavender, pink, lemon, and lime. So while, get it wrong again, Winslow Homer, did I get it right, Ellen? I got it right. While Winslow Homer may not have been a character, he's very much a character in the musical in terms of how this color and light is represented. Next slide. All right, now we got three people that you're going to meet when you come see this show. In the center is Evelyn Nesbitt. And over here on this side, this is Stanford White. Stanford White was one of the most well-known architects in New York City at the time. And we'll come into more details with him in just a moment. And on this side is an eccentric millionaire from Pittsburgh named Harry K. Thaw. Now, first I want to talk about Mr. White, because he represents a lot of the modernization that we first heard about when we deal with this musical Ragtime set at the turn of the previous century. There's a biography about Mr. White, in which the author writes, McKim, Mead, and White, that's the architecture firm that he worked for, their work was filtered through the lens of late 19th and early 20th century social change and an America reaching mightily to define itself. She says, I'm trying to get the readers into a time frame when America was building itself up. These guys started out from uncompromising and humbling roots, but they absorbed Europe, and by the 1880s, they see themselves as in a transforming mode. None of these three partners, McKim, Mead, or Mr. White, none of them came from wealth or social position. William Mead was the only member of the firm to complete a college degree. Charles McKim, after a year of Harvard, where he basically majored in baseball, left the school and became one of the first 5 Americans to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Stanford White, our character from our show, a son of a well-educated but impoverished intellectual, attended neither college or any place related to the École des Beaux-Arts. But, as McKim, his partner, noted, he could draw like a house afire. Once the firm was fully formed, all three would spend time in Europe to soak up and sketch the architecture of Normandy, England, and France. They also retrieved treasures that would stock the homes they were designing for the wealthy elite of New York City and Newport. I have to ask, are any of you watching The Gilded Age? Aha! You remember Mr. White showed up because he built the Russells' house and furnished it. And there was a spot in the miniseries when he was standing on the dock unloading all of the treasures that he had just brought for the Russells' home from Europe, right? That's him. That's him in real life. So, the issue here is that Mr. White, being a debonair, wealthy man about town, well, let's say he was a ladies' man. And let's say she's a lady. Evelyn Nesbitt's mother brought her to New York when she was 15, hoping to seek fame and fortune for Evelyn. And when she caught the attention of Mr. White, her mother was all about it. And Mr. White took Ms. Nesbitt to his apartment, And things happened there that would happen between a dirty old man and a 15-year-old girl, and let's just leave it there for right now. Several years later, she would marry Mr. Harry K. Thaw, because let's remember, she was looking for a position, and Harry K. Thaw was a wealthy millionaire from Pittsburgh, and as you can see, he's a real catch, isn't he? So, when you're looking for money and position and you got a daughter that's, the Gibson girl, then you marry Harry K. Thaw, and there you have it. Next slide. This is an old postcard of Madison Square Garden in New York City. It's the second of its 4 versions. And this was the masterpiece of Stanley White. He built this building. Now it's interesting, this is the postcard, this is an actual picture of it from another angle. There was a rooftop theater on the top of Madison Square Garden, and then you see this tower that rises up here. This is the actual picture of it. Mr. White managed to build himself a little apartment up in that tower. You follow where I'm going here? Mr. White handled his little liaisons with his young little girlfriend, Evelyn Nesbitt, up in that tower. Now, take a look up on the top of that tower, and then look at this. This is a sculpture that you can still see in New York. It's a copy of what had been put on the top, a little lightning rod put on the top of his tower. This is the Huntress Diana. And as you can see, is in her natural form here, right? Now, if you look way up on the top of that tower, do you see that Diana's got a little bit more going on than just that bow and arrow, right? That's because, now, this, by the way, is a person. So that's how far away Diana was from people, right? But the women in New York City knew that Diana was on the top of that building, naked. And they protested. So Mr. White made a few ribbons out of metal and wrapped them around Diana there. So when you were standing down here on this ground, you could safely look up into the skies and not be scandalized by the naked Diana. But Evelyn knew Diana was up there. And Evelyn knew what was going on. And Evelyn always told all of her friends, "My Stanny put me on the top of his tower." She was not real happy with the ribbons. This masterpiece of a building here, Madison Square Garden, would ultimately be the source of his undoing. Ms. Nesbitt was quite the celebrity. She was married to Mr. Thaw now, years have passed. And Mr. White was at the theater on the top of his building, attending a show called Madame Champagne. Ms. Nesbitt and her husband, Harry K. Thaw, were also attending the same musical. And at one point, the ladies in the chorus began to sing a little chorus number about being in love and the gentleman they were in love with. And her eccentric husband, Harry K. Thaw, walked up to Mr. White on the other side of the rooftop theater and said, "You took my wife's maidenhood," pulled out a gun, and shot his face off. Next slide. It became known as the crime of the century. And this is actually a front page, as you can see, of the Washington Times, decrying all of the mess. There's Evelyn right in the middle. There's Mr. Thaw on this side. And there's the late, at this point, the late Mr. White. Underneath of here, these are two of Mr. Thaw's this is his gold-digging sister and the Duke that she married. And over here, we see one of Mr. White's partners in his architectural firm. And this is a picture of Evelyn when she married Harry K. Thaw. And here it is, ladies and gentlemen, an illustration of the crime itself. It was known as the crime of the century, but as another one of our characters in the show will explain to you, it was 1906, and there were 94 years to go. Next. This is sort of the first time that we see these kind of celebrity murder trials happening, right? Such a sensation it was. This is poor Evelyn giving testimony in the murder trial here. The only picture of it that a reporter managed to snap real quick. It was an exclusive. This is Mr. Thaw in prison. In prison in New York City. Yeah, you get it, right? See the brass bed over here? See all the covers and the pillows? He had his dinner rolled in on a cart from Delmonico's every night. So this is poor Harry in prison enjoying his dinner with his tie on, of course, because it's dinner. And he's got all of the accoutrements. There's the silver and starched linen and everything. Poor man. And in the center there is an interesting thing I found. So pervasive was this in culture that they were writing ballads. That's Harry K. Thaw on the cover of the, quote, song sensation of the world, For the Sake of Wife and Home, suggested by the Thaw-White tragedy. It's a terrible song. But I want to read to you some of the lyrics. For the sake of a wife and home, he must spend all his days alone. A life for a life is the stern law's demand, unmerciful law which so few understand. There's a sad little woman in sorrow who forever must journey alone, while the mother of years pay the cost with her tears. For the sake of wife and home, you heard it here first. The song sensation of the world. Next slide. We're now more than 94 years past that, right? This is J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan plays a small but important role in our musical. J.P. Morgan was, as he explains to us himself in the course of the show, the wealthiest man on this earth. He represents big business in this show. You work hard for me, and you too could be wealthy. Of course, J.P. Morgan was making sure that he was the only one getting wealthy off the work you did for him, but we digress. We don't need to talk about that. He was famous not only for being the wealthiest man on this earth, but also getting the country out of financial difficulties not once but twice. The first time in the Panic of 1893, the United States had run out of gold. And due to laws, there was very little they could do about it. Mr. Morgan went to President Grover Cleveland and said, tell you what, I'm going to call my pals the Rothschilds, and between the two of us, we'll sell you some gold so you can get back, the Treasury can get its gold stocks back up and the United States will be okay. And Mr. Cleveland said, all right, that sounds like a plan. So they dug around in the laws and figured out a way to make it work, and the next thing you know, the country was solvent again. The second time, there was the Panic of 1907. See, they used to have a lot more panics than we have right now, but I'm afraid we might be panicking a little bit more frequently soon, yeah? In the Panic of 1907, the banks wouldn't play right with each other. Mr. Morgan was powerful enough that basically he went over to his mansion and said, I want all the bankers at my house now. They all showed up. He sat them down, locked the doors, and said, boys, we're not leaving until we solve this. And they did. Now, the upside of that is President Roosevelt at the time by now said, you have too much power. You are not an elected official. We got to make some antitrust laws and kick you out of the power business. So then he just moved over to the financial business, and we all know that J.P. Morgan is still doing pretty well to this day, right? If you've been in Times Square, you've seen all of the tall buildings and the lights, and well, there he is, folks. The namesake of all of that, J.P. Morgan. Next slide. Speaking of J.P. Morgan, this is the Morgan Library, also a principal character in our show. Up in the corner, you see the model, the original model for the Morgan Library. Who do you suppose designed it? Mr. White, he sure did. Mr. White designed it. This is what it looked like when it opened. This is what it looks like to this day, and this is its interior. It is a temple to the wealth of J.P. Morgan. He began to collect rare books and manuscripts, and he had collected so many that he said, I need some place to put these things. For me, I'd have just rented a storage unit. But he decided to build the Morgan Library. It was considered one of the grandest palaces of knowledge at the time that one could imagine. It is still there today, by the way. The next time you're in the city, you can go visit it. Once we are past the COVID scare, you can actually have dinner in J.P. Morgan's dining room if you would like to make reservations there. So all of this is still currently there, despite the plot of our musical, but now I'm giving away too much. Next slide. This is Admiral Percy. Admiral Percy is the man that discovered the North Pole, as you can see in this picture up here in this corner. Admiral Percy took off on his mission to discover the North Pole in 1908. In 1906, he made an expedition that was not successful because he couldn't understand how to keep himself alive very successful in the tundra. He went back again in 1908, and he took with him his second in command, Matthew Henson. Matthew Henson was born of freed slaves in Maryland, and Matthew Henson he was considered Admiral Perry's second in command, his first man. In our musical, one of our characters goes on the expedition on the SS Roosevelt along with Admiral Percy in that 1908 expedition, and he's a little taken aback by the fact that the second in command is an African American, and he's supposed to take orders from the African American who has such a high-ranking position in the great Admiral Perry's boat. But we digress. Next slide. This is the anarchist Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was also front page news back in the day because she was always creating difficulties. She was a political activist that immigrated to the United States in 1885 from Tsarist Russia. After coming here, and I have to tell you this specific story because it puts her in a nutshell. After coming to America, Goldman began working as a seamstress, sewing overcoats for more than 10 hours a day, earning $2.50 a week. She asked for a raise, she was denied, she quit, and became an anarchist. She would spend her life fighting for workers' rights, and what you see here is a picture of her. This is Emma here standing on the top of a car, and she is speaking to a group of workers in Union Square. Union Square was one of the places where these kinds of things occurred. It was a very familiar territory to her, and some writers say, I love this quote about hers, hers was the sensibility not of the intellectual, but of the artist. And she performed like an artist, and this is the key, dramatizing for others what they could hardly articulate for themselves. She could get up in front of a crowd of workers, a crowd of immigrants that can barely speak this language, and articulate to them what it was that they were dealing with, their hardships, their difficulties, how they could get out of them, and they made her their hero. She would, however, she also, by the way, I should say, ladies, she was one of the first feminists. She worked hard to fight not only for women's rights, but women's reproductive rights. That was actually one of the things that the men in charge finally had had enough of, and they sent her back to Russia. She made her way back here eventually, and she did die in the United States, but she was not nearly the force that she once upon a time was. But she was a lion that would fight for the rights of the workers for any cause whatsoever, and that's her function in our particular performance.